For thousands of years, the silkworm ceremony ensured that the empress was never just a figurehead. It was a rigorous, weeks-long ordeal of manual labor and spiritual isolation that transformed her into the mother of the empire. The origin of the silkworm ceremony, Qingcanli, can be traced back to the Zhou dynasty. Classical ritual texts describe a formal ritual that was led by a queen or the empress to honor Lei Zu, the primary wife of the Yellow Emperor. She is often credited for discovering silk in Chinese history. According to legend, Lei Zu was sitting under a mulberry tree when a silkworm cocoon accidentally dropped into her cup of hot tea. The hot tea softened the cocoon, revealing the shimmering thread that held it together. She began teaching the women of her court how to raise the silkworms and weave silk. And so, Lei Zu became the Can Shen, the silkworm goddess, and the production of silk became the divine responsibility of the palace woman. While the emperor performed sacrifices at the temple of agriculture to ensure a good grain harvest, the empress took on the spiritual burden of the silk harvest. This division of labor came to symbolize a social contract known as 男耕女织, which translates to men plow, women weave. Interestingly, modern archaeological evidence suggests that silk could have been harvested even before the age of Lei Zu, possibly going as far back as around 5000 BCE. The silkworm ceremony was a long ritual that would span many weeks, usually beginning in the 3rd month of the lunar calendar. And early versions could be conceptually captured through 4 stages: purification, sacrifice, personal labor, and reeling. The purpose of the silkworm ceremony was a prayer to the gods to bless the entire nation's silk production. If the empress didn't tend the silkworms, the gods wouldn't provide clothing. And it was also a part of the process to sanctify and produce sacred thread, which was used to create ceremonial attire that was worn by the emperor and empress during major events. Hey everyone, I'm Amy. Today we're going to step inside one of the most ancient rituals of Chinese history, the silkworm ceremony, and see how it evolved through the dynasties. Ancient China believed that the world was held together by a balance of labor. The emperor was the son of heaven, responsible for the grain that fed the empire, and the empress was the mother of the empire, responsible for the silk that clothed it. While Zhou dynasty ritual texts established the ideal of a silkworm altar and an empress-led ceremony, it was the Han dynasty that gave the ceremony its imperial form. The silkworm ceremony began as a smaller private ritual, where only the empress and the women of the inner court were allowed to participate, overseen by appointed silkworm officials who managed the operations of the silkworm chambers. The silkworm ceremony began with purification. The empress and her court would enter a period of ritual purification, reducing noise, display, and indulgence. Once purified, her destination was the silkworm chamber, located within the imperial gardens, where the mulberry groves were maintained. This is where the empress would offer wine and livestock, pleading for a harvest that would clothe the nation. Before picking the mulberry leaves, the empress would first wash the silkworm eggs in a ceremonial basin of herbal water, a ritual later known as yucan, the bathing of the eggs. By personally waking the worms in this room, she was claiming responsibility for the life cycle of the empire's silk. Then came the ritual of picking mulberry leaves to feed the imperial silkworms, later known as sanyi, the 3 pickings. The empress would cut 3 branches, followed by consorts according to rank. Once these inaugural branches were harvested, the work of 摘叶, or leaf picking, began. Thousands of leaves had to be picked to feed the imperial silkworms. The empress and other high-ranking women participated in this labor, but they alone could not feed and take care of all of the silkworms. The silkworm chamber employed a number of specialized attendants who maintained the chamber and ensured the silkworms were properly fed and cared for. The ritual was also a period of extreme purity because silkworms were incredibly sensitive. Later sericulture traditions would codify this into specific taboos. While the empress was tending the worms, No one was allowed to wear pungent perfumes or even create loud noises. It was believed that disturbance or impurity could cause the silkworms to die, which would be seen as a direct reflection of the empress's lack of virtue. Once the silkworm cycle was complete, the empress returned to symbolically reel the first silken thread from the cocoons, and the thread was handed over to the imperial weaving rooms. Here, the empire's most skilled artisans used special weaving technology to turn the sacred thread into the complex, multicolored brocades required for the imperial court. The final stage of the ritual was the offering. The silk that the empress had initiated was presented at the ancestral temple, where it was consecrated for the use in ceremonial garments, including the mianfu of the emperor. Following the completion of the ritual, silk and other rewards could be distributed within the court, formally closing the ceremony. Around 60 CE, the virtuous Empress Ma became the standard bearer for the silkworm ceremony. The empress realized that if the women in the palace only saw silk as a luxury, they would forget that their status was tied to their service to the state. She understood that the empress and the consorts were not just there to be pretty. They were also representative of the production of clothing for the entire empire. In order to make her point, the empress chose to wear plain, undyed silk. She famously told them that she wore this plain silk to show that the empress's value came from the labor of the ceremony, not from the price of her clothes. This labor of silkworm ceremony is what turned silk into a noble status marker. Because the empress personally sanctified the fabric through her ritual, silk became a symbol of legitimacy. However, the empress and the imperial palace wasn't the only place producing silk. By the Han Dynasty, peasants across the Yellow River Valley could raise silkworms in their own homes. But there was a massive divide between normal silk and the imperial silk. The empress acted as the guardian of the empire's social order. While a farmer could produce normal silk, the imperial weaving rooms produced the complex brocade that was often restricted for commoners to own. The silkworm ceremony, combined with the secret weaving technology of the imperial weaving rooms, became a divine seal of approval that separated the imperial quality of silk from the fabric produced by commoners. As we move into the Tang Dynasty, the meaning of silk underwent a massive transformation. Because of the expansion of the Silk Road, the Tang Dynasty was now a part of a global trade network. In the Han Dynasty, silk was a symbol of moral virtue. In the Tang Dynasty, it became the currency of the empire. According to the Tang Code, silk bolts were used as a standard for taxation, government fines, gifts for official salaries, and even as a payment for peace with the nomadic tribes. In the eyes of the law, a roll of silk was as stable as a bar of gold. Because the empress sat at the very top of this production chain, she was essentially the governor of the imperial mint. But this global demand created a problem for the palace. If the whole world was wearing silk, how could the imperials remain superior? This is where the silkworm ceremony evolved. The Tang Dynasty didn't just continue the rituals of the previous dynasties, they magnified it. While the Han Dynasty empress might have led a small, private group for the silkworm ceremony, the Tang Dynasty empress turned it into a statewide exhibition. The Tang Dynasty established a ritual bureaucracy divided into two distinct groups: the Nei Mingfu, or inner noble women, who were the imperial consorts and high-ranking women who lived within the palace. In earlier dynasties, the silkworm ceremony was primarily managed by the equivalent of these inner noble women. And then there was the Wai Mingfu, or outer noble women, who were the wives, mothers, and daughters of the high-ranking officials and generals. When Wu Zetian of the Tang Dynasty first became empress, she faced constant attacks on her legitimacy, with many officials viewing her as immoral. She needed to prove that she was the rightful mother of the empire, so she used the silkworm ceremony as a massive political statement. In 656 CE, she led an unprecedented silkworm ceremony by inviting the outer noblewomen to participate. According to historical records, the empress led the wives of officials and the noble ladies, a total of 1,000 people, to the altar to perform the silkworm ceremony. Wu Zetian was extending her authority beyond the palace walls. These outer noblewomen were excited by an opportunity to be part of what was historically restricted to only inner noblewomen. By successfully commending so many outer noblewomen, Wu Zetian was showing the officials that she could control their families. And with such a massive ritual, Wu Zetian secured her position as empress in the eyes of the people. Tang Dynasty sources describe the silkworm ceremony taking place in spring, followed by the symbolic mulberry picking, staged with strict court hierarchy and participation from noblewomen. And specialized complexes were built, known as Cangong, or silkworm palaces. According to historical records, these buildings were designed with specific ventilation to keep the imperial silkworms at a perfect temperature. After the first ritual of purification, the empress would lead a grand procession out of the palace, traveling to the mulberry grounds and silkworm altar in the suburbs of Chang'an. This was an important political statement. The capital needed to see the mother of the empire physically leaving the imperial palace to labor for the empire. The climax of the ritual was the Saosi, the reeling of the cocoons. The empress would be the first to dip the cocoon into a golden basin of boiling water to find the lead thread. Once she pulled the first strand of silk, it was seen as the life thread of the empire's economy. Following the silkworm ceremony, the empress led a grand ritual procession back into the city. The sacred thread was carried in silk-draped baskets through the Gate of Perpetual Joy, the Changle Men. From there, the procession moved along the Ming Street toward the ancestral temples and the Daming Palace. This return journey across the capital was a message that the mother of the empire had fulfilled her ritual duty to secure the dynasty's prosperity. By the time we reached the Song dynasty, the world had changed. The secret of silk had already leaked out. And silk was no longer a mystery. It was a global commodity, because commoners and merchants could now buy high-quality silk on the open market. The imperial court had to pivot. The silkworm ceremony was no longer about proving the empress could produce silk. It was about proving she could produce the best silk. In the Song dynasty, the ritual shifted away from the magnified energy of the Tang dynasty and toward a philosophy of extreme refinement. This refinement was about creating the perfect condition used to create the silk. This meant that the empress's primary duty shifted to the management of the silkworm rooms. Conditions like temperature, smell, and silence were now treated as direct expressions of the empress's internal virtue. To maintain this monopoly on quality, the palace managed a network of specialized weaving workshops led by the Wensi Yuan, the court of state craftsmanship. These workshops were located in the palace and in silk hubs like Suzhou and Hangzhou. While the empress provided the spiritual start of the season through her ritual, the artisans took that sacred thread and spent thousands of hours turning it into the emperor's robes and the harem's status symbol. This kept the empire's highest grade patterns, specifications, and its supply chain under imperial control. Around the same time, a shift in philosophy also began to take place. Neo-Confucianism started to become popular, and it emphasized that a woman's power was internal, changing the lives of women in the imperial harem completely. The goal was no longer to stand out, but to be proper and reserved. This time period also saw the rise of the tragic foot binding. While historical records don't explicitly say that the empress couldn't walk, they describe a change in the ceremony's operations. According to the history of Song, the empress no longer walked the groves and was instead assisted by servants, while using a tool to bring the branches to her, possibly suggesting that her feet were bound. This tool was formalized as the Jingou, or golden hook, which was a long ornamental pole that allowed her to reach the mulberry branches without having to climb or overextend herself. This shifted the act from manual labor to an act of selection. the empress was a judge of quality, choosing only the perfect leaves for the imperial silkworms. Then, for nearly a century, the ritual stopped. The Yuan dynasty, ruled by the Mongols, had no interest in the ancient Chinese silkworm ceremony, instead prioritizing the cotton and wool of the grasslands. When the Ming dynasty overthrew the Yuan dynasty, they were obsessed with returning to pure Han Chinese roots and revived the silkworm ceremony, mostly reinstating the rituals and traditions of earlier dynasties. In earlier dynasties, the sacred thread could move through different palace workshops depending on need. But in the Ming dynasty, this flexibility disappeared. Once reeled, silk entered a centralized 制造局, where its processing and final use were determined in advance by court regulation. Another change was the location. In the Ming dynasty, the silkworm ceremony was moved closer to the actual imperial palace. Some records describe the empress performing the ceremony in the West Garden, because it was inconvenient to have the empress travel out to the suburbs. By fixing the ceremony inside the palace and routing the silk through centralized imperial workshops, the Ming dynasty court turned the ritual into a closed system. Even though the rest of the world had silk, the empress and the imperial court protected its standard, specifications, and symbolic origin. The value of imperial silk no longer came from secrecy, but from ritual correctness. When the Manchu rulers established the Qing dynasty, they spent many years consolidating power, leaving the ancient silkworm ceremony dormant. That changed in 1742, when Emperor Qianlong decided to revive the ritual to prove that the Qing dynasty were the true heirs to Chinese tradition. He ordered the construction of a new silkworm altar known as the Xiancan Tan, and Empress Fu Cha led the first revival of the ritual in the Qing dynasty in 1744. The Qing dynasty ritual was a multi-part performance of power, defined by the collected statues of the Qing dynasty. The empress first gathered her court in the Hall of Union, and only high-ranking women were allowed to participate. Here, she performed a preliminary rite to inspect the ceremonial tools. The empress handled a golden hook. Princesses and high-ranking consorts used silver hooks, and the wives of high-ranking officials were restricted to hooks of simple red lacquer. It began with the Yitan, the formal procession to the silkworm altar. The empress would exit the Shen Wumen in a special carriage reserved solely for this day, and journey to the silkworm altar. Interestingly, imperial women could not be seen by commoners, so the procession had to be concealed. When the empress left the Forbidden City, the streets were cleared, and the path was lined with silk curtains or folding screens to block the view of any civilians. The following day was the Gongsang Li, where the empress would use a golden hook to pick exactly 3 leaves. Immediately after, she ascended the Guansang Tai, an elevated viewing balcony. From this height, she would observe the other consorts, princesses, and noble ladies harvest from the mulberry trees. At the center of the grove stood the palace sericulture specialists, dressed in plain work clothes. They were the actual technical experts hired or selected by the imperial household department to manage the silkworms. Following the harvest, the empress led the procession to the Qingcan Dian, or the Hall of the Imperial Silkworm. It was inside this hall that the freshly picked leaves were transferred from the ceremonial baskets to the rearing trays. This hall served as the bridge between the public outdoor harvest to the private care that followed. Next, the ritual shifted to the silkworm palace for the rearing period, which was around a month. It was here that the empress practiced the ritual of feeling the warmth. This practice was believed to have started in earlier dynasties, but was officially codified during the Qing dynasty. The empress would test the temperature of the mulberry leaves or the silkworm trays against her own cheek. If the environment felt too cold or too hot to her skin, the silkworm palace was immediately adjusted, building a physical bond between the mother of the empire and her imperial silkworm children. The cycle ended with the Xianjian, where the finest cocoons were brought to the empress, who then presented them to the emperor and empress dowager. but the labor didn't stop at the harvest. Once the silk was reeled, it was sent to the imperial workshops, the 造办处, to be dyed, and some would be tailored into the very robes the empress would wear for the next year's ritual. This restored silkworm ceremony would become a vital responsibility for the women of the Qing dynasty court. However, by the late 19th century, the world was changing again. Steam-powered looms and cheap cotton were being brought in, and large amounts of mass-produced silk were being exported. And inside the Forbidden City, the women of the imperial harem were clinging to the old ways. Silk was no longer just fancy clothing. It was a resistance against a changing world. The economic importance of the palace silkworms were now negligible. The few pounds of silk produced from the imperial silkworms could not compete with the industrial output of the provinces. And so, the silkworm ceremony became about symbolic legitimacy. The dominant figure during this time period was Empress Dowager Cixi, who used the silkworm ceremony to reinforce her authority. According to the records of her lady-in-waiting, De Ling, Her Majesty took a great interest in the silkworms. She would personally visit the silk house to inspect the trays and ensure the temperature and feeding were being handled according to the ancient rules. The Empress Dowager didn't just care about the worms, she cared about the theater of it. She famously had herself painted as the goddess of mercy, often draped in thousands of pearls sewn into her silk robes. In 1888, Empress Dowager Cixi ordered a major renovation of the silkworm altar and its surrounding mulberry groves, which was a significant and expensive project. By rebuilding the site, Empress Dowager Cixi hoped to use the ancient rites to project a message of stability and cultural authority. Unfortunately, by that time, the empire was facing external threats, as well as an economic decline, and even lavish silkworm ceremonies were unable to restore the glory of the Qing dynasty. When the Qing dynasty finally fell in 1912, the silkworm ceremony ended with it. The sacred mulberry groves were no longer the site of imperial rituals, and the mother of the empire no longer had silkworms to feed. The golden thread that had connected every empress back to Lei Zu was finally cut. By sanctifying the silk through her own hands, the empress turned imperial silk into a status that money could not buy. Today, the silkworm altar in Beijing stands as a quiet reminder of this ancient ritual. The ceremony eventually faded, but its legacy remains woven into the very concept of Chinese empires. However, this tradition didn't disappear entirely. Back in the Tang Dynasty, the rituals of the silkworm ceremony traveled all the way to Japan. And then, in 1871, Empress Shokan of Japan formally established Japan's very own version of the silkworm ceremony, as a way to encourage Japan's own silk industry. Even today, the Empress of Japan still personally raises silkworms every year at the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. What do you think about the silkworm ceremony as the incredible thread that connected all empresses in Chinese history? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.